So, did you know that Americans have more possessions than any society in history?
Yeah.
Anyone surprised? No. Good eye roll there. Well, apparently it has been scientifically established. There's a team of anthropological researchers from UCLA, and they set up an entire analysis of American homes. They identified 32 typical American families to work with, and they went in and they did what many, like think about an archaeological dig, and they get every last object, and they catalog it, and they keep track of where it is, and then they start to try to understand about these people's relationships with their artifacts and what that says about who they are and the culture that they live in. So researcher Jean Arnold said, contemporary US households, we have discovered, have more possessions per household than any other society in global history. And her colleague, Anthony Grace, noted that our homes literally reflect this massive material abundance. I mean, he looked around, he's like, yeah, you can see it in our garages, and you can see it in our home offices, and you can even see it in the corners of our living rooms and our dining rooms and our bedrooms. We have a lot of stuff, they said, and we have easy ways to accumulate more possessions and not a lot of mechanisms they discovered in our culture for going the other direction. So like I said, no surprise here. The interesting thing about that study was they chose specifically dual income families with children, school-age children. So, stuff intensive time of life. And one of the things that they worked out is that for a lot of these families, the stuff is actually kind of a trade-off for the thing that they think they have a scarcity of, which is time. No surprise there, right? I mean, they looked at things like the lack of time to cook, and the lack of time to shop. And so what they would do is they would go to a big box store, they would get giant boxes of convenience food, they would put them in their extra freezer, and then pull them out, and hopefully that made all of that easier. Only the researchers did some math, and it turned out, how much per meal they saved by doing all this?
None.
4 minutes. 4 minutes. And the other thing they discovered, which is interesting, is when they started doing their statistical analysis around this, is that they worked out the United States has 3% of the world's children, but statistically, we have 40% of the world's toys per child. Yeah. And guess what? Lots of American families, they feel burdened by the management of all of our possessions. So it sounds a little bit crazy. Wouldn't it just be easier to forego all of the stuff? Well, it was Prime Day this week. Anyone else succumb to the temptation to buy something you didn't necessarily need?
Oh yeah.
Yep. Of course. For me, it's our oldest birthday tomorrow, and I logged in to get some things from her Amazon wish list. And of course, they were such good deals that I just got her everything on the list. Which I don't think was what she was asking for, but So I have to say, I am the last person to judge. And I'm gonna guess that few, if any of us here today, can claim that we are not people of many possessions. Yeah. And so I think we can all kind of sympathize with that fellow that came and he kneeled before Jesus. Now, I'm told that kneeling was what people did when they came to Jesus to seek healing. And I don't even know if he knew what he was seeking healing from. I mean, it doesn't sound like he was particularly aware before Jesus brought it up that perhaps his possessions were creating barriers that made it difficult for him to say yes to that invitation to follow Jesus in the way of kingdom. That we are weighed down with possessions is, I don't think, news to us today. I can tell, eye rolls, right? We've heard this before. There are modern-day prophets all around us who decry the ills of consumerism, from the garbage that we generate to the drain on our non-renewable resources, to the invisible to us but yet quite terrible toll that it takes on the factory workers in far away places. I mean, we get it. And many of us want to change our relationship with stuff. I mean, there's popular movements to help us with this, like the Simplicity movement and the Marie Kondo book. Anyone tried that? Still, we all struggle. Most Americans struggle with our clutter. I think it could take a huge miracle to heal our society from this pervasive epidemic of stuff. And, you know, see the cover of your bulletin? See how fat that camel is? I have a feeling it might be easier to get that really fat camel through the eye of the needle than to completely transform American society so that we're not so burdened by our possessions. So what are we to do with the words of Jesus to us here? I mean, let's face it, they give us pause. Now, if any of you have been following the SALT Project podcasts from Matthew Meyer Bolton that I have been linking to in the PIP each week, you will have picked up that it's possible that this that Jesus is laying out before this man today is not a test. It's not something that he or we can pass so much as something that we are meant to keep wrestling with. Now, Matthew Meyer Bolton uses in his podcast the image of a boxing ring. But for me, I think it works more if we imagine it as a kind of ropes course. And I'm not talking about the easy kind, the ones that are meant to be challenging when you go to summer camp, but ultimately you can all manage to figure it out. I'm thinking it's more like the kinds of courses that get set for things like, you know, like American Ninja Warrior. Anyone seen that TV show? Okay, I'll have to describe it for you. And I'm not even sure if it's still on TV, but it was certainly really huge about a decade ago. And they would, it's reality TV, and they would set up these essentially like ropes courses, and they would have all these obstacles, and they involved strength and balance, lots of climbing, jumping back and forth, only they were set over top of these pits of water. So if you lost balance, you're in the water. But the interesting thing about this particular contest is that few, if any, competitors would actually finish the course. Most of them did not make it. I think they were aiming for like a 10 to 15% completion rate. And if people started being able to ace it, well, they just started making it harder. They had this thing called the warped wall. It was really hard to climb. And as the seasons progressed, they just kept making it higher and higher and higher because, you know, gotta keep the excitement in there. They wanted the participants to keep at it, even when they couldn't master all of the obstacles. Well, over and over again in Mark's gospel, Jesus sets this really high bar for what it means to be his follower. In fact, just a few weeks ago, he asked his disciples to give no less than their very lives for the sake of the good news. I mean, that's a lot to ask of people. And Jesus is also known for his use of hyperbole in the Gospel of Mark. I mean, like, for example, does Jesus really want me to tear my eye out when I look with a little bit of covetousness at, say, that zippy little sports car that's always parked around the corner from my house? It's kind of pretty. Not really a car person, but this one. At the same time, Mark's portrayal of Jesus shows him that he has deep compassion, and that he exercises compassion with both his own followers and all of the one-time seekers that come before him when they struggle with what it means to walk the way of the kingdom of God. And I think we get all of those things in this little passage that we have here today. It starts with this great question: what must I do? Asked the man. I mean, he is looking for the secret to making it over the finish line into eternal life. Now, he's clearly a pious person who has always tried to live a good life and be a good person. But Jesus kind of reminds him that all of us, except God, are right there with him in still striving and struggling and wrestling to be good people. We still find ourselves sometimes, losing our balance, ending up down there in the water. Then Jesus, he ups the game. He lays it right out before him, this pretty extreme obstacle. Sell everything. Give the money to the poor, and then come and follow me. Now, clearly, it's not something that every person can do. It's a reach goal, shall we say. I mean, if everybody sold everything, who would be buying it? It doesn't work from an economic system point of view. But you get the point. The disciples definitely get the point, because they say to Jesus, hey, we gave up pretty much everything to be here following you. And Jesus says, yeah, you know what? And that walk with me is just going to keep getting harder and harder. My guess is that early Christians as a whole had a very mixed record on the front of giving up everything they owned and sharing with the poor before they entered Christian community. It comes up a lot in the New Testament, both in the Gospels and in the Epistles. In fact, if you go to Paul's writing, you can find a lot of different places where he is in fact correcting his young churches on the conflicts that are coming up over the sharing of stuff. Some people are doing it, some people aren't doing it enough, it's all over the place. It's, I think, pretty likely that each early Christian community did in fact have great exemplars who did sell everything and had shared it all and held it in common and that kind of thing. But I think they also had a lot of people who needed frequent reminding, had to be called out, because there were things that they just couldn't manage to give up. I mean, Jesus uses what is, I have to admit, a pretty humorous image, trying to get a camel through the eye of a needle. You gotta laugh just thinking about it. It makes me think of a toddler sitting there, those little workbenches that they had with the hammer and the little pegs, yep. And they're trying to get the square peg in the round hole. And what does the little toddler do? Wham, 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 wham. They just keep going at it until they get frustrated, possibly even melt down. You can hear that frustration in the words of the disciples when they say, when to Jesus, who can possibly be saved if this is the bar? And Jesus says to them, well, for mortals, it's impossible to save yourself. But for God, all things are possible. God's the one that does the saving here in this equation. So, I mean, all parents, we sit there and we look at our toddler and we think, they just need a different peg. So a parent often reaches into the pile of pegs and sips out the round one and says, here, try this one. And it works. Only you're going to be making that same suggestion to the toddler the next day and the day after that and the day after that. It's a long process. So we know that man with many possessions, he walked away from this encounter with Jesus feeling discouraged. But I have to say, I do not believe for a minute that was the end of this man's story. Because I'm guessing that he, from that moment on, started to wrestle with the challenge that Jesus had laid before him. And I like to think that he did start selling his stuff bit by bit. I mean, isn't that what we would all do if Jesus said that to us face to face? And I think it's what all of us do all the time. We wrestle with our relationship with our stuff, and we try to give up as much as we can bring ourselves to. But still, it's hard to give away everything. So part of me wishes that we knew if this man made it back to Jesus, having fully unburdened himself of his stuff, and said, okay, Jesus, I did what you said. I am now ready to be your follower. But I have to say, maybe it's better this way. Because we don't know if that man made it through the entire sort of path that Jesus laid before him. But my guess is he's just like us, and he's still in the wrestling. And the other thing is, what we do know from Jesus' words is that God continues to work transformation in this man and in all of us, because that's God's job. That's what God does. So, what must I do? Well, I think we start by remembering that this stuff thing is not a test. It's not something that we can just pass, so much as something that we are meant to keep wrestling with. And all of those things that we cling to most tightly as ours and just can't bring ourselves to share, well, letting go of them so that we can trust God and love and serve our neighbors and follow Jesus is in fact a big reach for us. And the obstacles can sometimes feel insurmountable. It's not something that we can do on our own, nor are we meant to. But that also does not mean that we can just throw up our hands and sit on the sidelines and not be in there wrestling with the challenge. And I have to say, we all know someone who has done this, who has sold it all, given everything in service of God and neighbor. And those people, they are an important part of what helps us as we do our own wrestling. But I think that for most of us, the call is to step across the start line and to look for the path that Jesus has laid out before us through all of those obstacles that our many possessions present to us. We're going to lose our balance as we try to shed those things, to transform that relationship. We're going to fall in the water. I know we are, over and over again. But we will make it past maybe this obstacle sometimes and the other one another time, and we will figure out some things along the way. Only as we're in it, things change all the time. New obstacles may arise. Like, you may win the lottery. It could happen, right? But giving fully of yourself, of what you've been given, to others is a spiritual discipline. And it's something we must continue to wrestle with and renew. I mean, anyone besides me ever read the monastic rules for community that were written in the Middle Ages? You have, Stephen. They're full of rules about this stuff thing, right? Quite. Yeah, it's crazy. Even the very people who have in fact sold everything and given their entire lives to God and technically own nothing are still busy, clearly fighting over stuff. It's something we will always wrestle with. Salvation is not a race that we win based on our own greatness of spiritual prowess, effort, or even sheer dogged determination. Transformation is worked on us and in us and through us by God and in God's time. So our job, just keep on